And we'll get going. So welcome. If you've joined us for the first time especially, you've joined the Citizens Climate Lobby Australia's monthly meeting with a guest speaker. And this is where some Citizens Climate Lobby groups around Australia get together, have a lunch, have a meeting, and obviously a guest speaker will speak for a little while. And the meeting is usually in two parts. The first part is the presentation and Q&A, and usually that's about half an hour all up, or 40 minutes or so. And then the second part is for Citizens Climate Lobby members to have and then to talk through about 10 to 15 minutes of national update. And so that's the last part of the meeting. And then sometimes the Queensland team will stay on the Zoom and have a meeting. I'm not sure if that's happening this time, but that's from 3 o'clock onwards. So we'll find out later on if that's happening and who wants to stay on to that one. So we'll get going. We are recording, and this will be available on the Citizens Climate Lobby Australia YouTube channel as well. And we're very lucky today to have Jim Allen, the South Australian Regional Coordinator for Citizens Climate Lobby, and Verity Morgan-Schmidt, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Farmers for Climate Action, a relatively new player in the climate advocacy space, doing exciting things with a team, of course. We can't introduce everybody on the team, but maybe another time we can meet you all, Verity. Thank you so much for joining. Now, Jim has been doing some digging around, finding out what is in the pipeline in terms of large-scale renewable energy projects in Australia. And finding that there's an interesting crossover with regional electorates, and Citizens Climate Lobby does meet members of Parliament from all over Australia, and we are particularly interested in advocacy on climate with members of Parliament and regional electorates. So that is one of the pieces of research that we'll be able to make good use of. And Verity's organisation works with rural MPs all the time. So it'll be really fascinating to see this sort of different angle that we wouldn't normally have access to. If you can share that information and learn from each other, I think that's going to happen today. So thank you both for joining. I will just give you a little bit of bio about our speakers, really, really short. You may have read this already. Jim is, as I said, Citizens Climate Lobby's Regional Coordinator for South Australia. He's also a qualified town planner, and he helped prepare South Australia's climate change strategy, which of course is one of the best in the world. So that's a little bit about Jim. There's so much more to him. But now Verity is, as I said, the CEO of Farmers for Climate Action. You might know of Farmers for Climate Action on Twitter as Farming Forever. Is that right, Christy and Verity? Farming Forever? Yep. And Verity is a member of Citizens Climate Lobby as well. She's originally from the sheep and wheat country of Western Australia. And she's a former executive officer for Western Australian Farmers Foundation. She's been the executive officer for Country Noosa, which is an organisation linking hinterland producers to coastal communities in southeast Queensland. She holds a Master of Arts in Politics and Sustainability and Bachelor of Arts with a double major in Politics and Global Studies. And yeah, so we're very pleased to meet you, Verity, after all of this time admiring your work. Take it away, guys.
Well, thanks, Jodie, for that introduction. Just a few disclosures to start off with. I'm not an expert in renewable energy, and I'm not from a rural electorate either, although my local government career has taken me to a couple of jobs in regional Australia. And as you said, I've been digging around, trying to find out where the big renewable energy projects are proposed and happening, and trying to relate that back to federal electorates and the people that CCL and Farmers for Climate Action go to see and lobby about climate. So I'm curious to find out how rural Australia and politicians might contribute to a faster transition to a low carbon economy, and how CCL might support that in its strategies for engagement. So I'm going to read, because I'm on a learning curve with this, so I've written some notes, so I will be looking down on occasions. Sorry if that's distracting. And I'm very pleased to be sharing this talk with Verity, since her group has been has had a lot of experience in engaging with rural MPs. Rural Australia does most of the generating clean energy. My perception is that rural communities are largely supportive of this, and the surge of large renewable energy projects underway or in the development pipeline at the moment are largely about 20 to 30 rural electorates. A report commissioned by the Clean Energy Council estimates that each 100 megawatt of new renewable energy would create 96 direct local jobs, 285 state jobs, and 475 national jobs in construction. Obviously, these numbers fall significantly when the power stations are operating, as they would whether it's renewables or non-renewables. Though renewables offer jobs and growth, a common perception of rural politicians is they are hostile to renewables, as well as resistant to what climate science tells us. And when we hear Barnaby Joyce, that tends to confirm our fears. But certain interests are stronger in some rural electorates than others, and increasingly renewable energy is becoming an interest. Not every electorate has coal as a significant part of its economic base, or irrigation, or sugar, or tourism. So it's not a case of expect all rural politicians to think alike. In South Australia, where the boom in renewable energy generation is the most advanced, it's been largely confined to two federal electorates, which are rural. And it's sounding very like the new South Australian government and its energy minister in particular, who's from the country, are favourably disposed to renewable energy. Looking at it very simply, it's a path to regional jobs and growth. British billionaire Sanjeev Gupta has referred to a political bipartisanship on renewable energy in South Australia, and that's underpinned his investment in the Wireless Steelworks and his plans for renewables. To varying extents, other renewable energy hubs are being welcomed by politicians in other states and regions. According to a recent article in The Conversation, 640 megawatts of solar and wind capacity is likely to be installed in Australia by 2020. The development interest is far greater. There are some 30,000 megawatts of prospective generation in Queensland alone, as at May 2018. Almost all of it is from renewables. These projects are talking points that make the news, even if locally, and even if they don't ultimately proceed. As I'm not an insider, it's hard to separate the speculative from the realistic expectations. Much depends on policies and new infrastructure, including proposals for new interconnectors between the states and across Bass Straits, and even across the Timor Sea, in one instance. I've done a rough electoral distribution of potential growth based on announcements and reports and reliable maps, like the one the Queensland government has put out on power stations, proposed and existing. I've ranked electorates based on the amount of on the amount of estimated power capacity in uncommenced projects. The top 20 electorates for prospective renewable generation, 17 held by the Coalition, 2 held by the RLP, and Kennedy, which is held by Bob Catter of the Australian Catter Party. All are rural, 6 are at least partly in Northern Australia, including Bob Catter's. The 2 ALP electorates are only in there because of pumped hydro proposals, being backed by the Coalition. And solar wind. Agriculture Minister David Littleproud has the electorate with the second most megawatt of potential installed capacity. He's recently spoken in support of renewables. About half of the installed capacity under construction is wind. The bulk of this and prospective generation is in the eastern states, so the emphasis is shifted from South Australia. Solar PV is the other major component. So is there light at the end of a tunnel in terms of shifting Australian Conservatives on climate? Well, with renewable energy, the answer is yes. I can't resist quoting Bob Catter, the member for Kennedy in Far North Queensland. He says, "How could any government conceive of the stupidity like baseload coal-fired power station in North Queensland?" So bridging the gap between investor ambition, which is all in renewables, and policy ambition, which is still talking about coal, is going to be an interesting journey. I think it's essential that the National Energy Guarantee is capable of driving meaningful emissions reduction. Unlike a carbon fee and dividend, that's not a sole purpose or even an essential purpose, really. It depends on government and it depends on political will. I think connecting with rural politicians is a great way to bridge the political divide, and perhaps a safer discussion on climate will flow from the regional benefits of renewable energy which have been realised in some of these electorates. And that's me. I've got a lot of data that's not necessarily particularly reliable, but I'm happy to answer questions later about that and about the electorates which are most important for renewable energy. But I think it's important to have a discussion about engaging with rural politicians, and that's really where Verity is better qualified. So over to you, Verity.
Thanks so much, Jim. Lovely to hear all of the research that you've been doing. And thanks to Jody and to everyone for having FCA on the call today. I've been, obviously, a member of CCL, and I've caught up with Rod Mitchell on occasion and just been watching with great admiration the team of volunteers you have across the country who are really working very, very hard to put that influence onto our politicians, both rural and urban. So thank you for the work that you've all been doing, and thank you to all for making the time to dial in today. I'll just acknowledge one of our board members is actually on the call. I'm delighted to flag Christy, who is also very actively involved in CCL, but we are very lucky over at Farmers for Climate Action to have Christy from Gamelling in WA actually sit around our board table as well. And I think the relationships she has in rural Australia and her understanding of what matters to those communities is really an important asset for both of our organisations. So I'm just so glad you're able to dial in today, Christy. Okay, so I'll just flag very quickly an article that came out yesterday in the Northern Daily Leader, which I'm not sure if any of you will have seen yet. Adam Marshall is the Nationals MP at a state level out there in the New England region, and this is an opinion piece that he's published. And so the last line, I'll just read it directly to you because it ties in very well with Jim's comments. So it is, renewable energy just makes sense on any measure. It is all happening for renewables and we are powering along. We need to keep our foot on that pedal too, and not just traditional generation methods. And I think that speaks very well to the comments that Jim has just made about the importance of renewable energy to regional electorates. So New England is in the epicentre of that, in New South Wales at least, where it is receiving significant wind generation capacity. And it's fascinating to see that same electorate, which at a federal level is represented by one of the biggest climate naysayers, has their state representative coming out so publicly and strongly in support of renewable energy. So I think there is definitely a lot of reason to hope that Conservative MPs are actually going to start shifting on these issues. And indeed, I believe they already have. So I'll just quickly give a bit of a background to Farmers for Climate Action. I think my dog's being chased by that snake, but anyway, we'll leave that alone. There's barking happening. Now, just a bit of background to Farmers for Climate Action. So we are, as Jody mentioned, a relatively new organisation. We incorporated back in April last year, and from that time have absolutely gone from strength to strength. So much so that within the next fortnight, we're actually putting on board 2 new staff members, and we'll have grown from a staff of 1 in May last year to a staff of 6, which I think speaks volumes about the level of interest and engagement that there is in rural and regional Australia in these issues at the moment. Rural Australia has had a reputation for a long time of not being particularly switched on to climate. The reality is that that is changing at a dramatic rate. We've seen significant policy shifts occur in the National Farmers Federation as the industry peak body in 2016. The end of 2016, the National Farmers Federation came out with a new policy position recognising the impacts of climate change on Australian agriculture. We've since seen that that position internally has continued to grow across the NFF family. More and more organisations are not only looking at climate as something that, you know, is occurring on the side, they're starting to bring it more into the centre of their decision making and their engagement. And I'm very proud to say that FCA is playing a key role in that. We represent and work with farmers from right across Australia, farmers, graziers, industry leaders, and of course, interested community members as well. I think it's very important to recognise that rural and regional Australia is also made up of a very diverse group of interests. And of course, along the agri-food and agri-fibre supply chains, there are a whole whole stack of people who are interested in these issues, and even though they may not directly be on the land, they are very keen in ensuring the long-term prosperity and sustainability of Australian agriculture. And of course, climate change is a key issue there. As an organisation, we've just gone through our very first strategic planning process, which was very, very exciting. We have a board that stretches from Longreach in Western Queensland in Maranoa through to just outside Hobart up in the Highlands in Tasmania, and then of course across to Geraldton and Goomalling in Western Australia. So actually being able to pull that board together and having the expertise and the experience from electorates and also from on the ground right across our country was absolutely invaluable. So out of that strategic planning process, we have 4 core priority areas that we're going to be working on, and a couple of those are particularly pertinent to CCL's work in engaging with Conservative politicians. So we're going to be working on making sure that the ag sector is climate smart. So behind the farm gate, farmers are supported to adapt and mitigate the impacts of climate change. Farmers beyond the farm gate are mobilised as a sector to become strong advocates on climate change and for renewable energy. We're working on mobilising farmers in campaigns to transition away from fossil fuel dependence and into greater support for renewables and quicker rollout of renewables across regional Australia. And lastly, we are going to be focusing our efforts across 6 core electorates, which interestingly enough tie in quite well with the electorates that Jim has raised in his analysis in terms of those that are already receiving a fair share of the renewable energy investment that we are seeing. Now, I think, Jim, you raised before the importance of engaging with Conservative MPs, and I'm just trying to remember your exact words, but engaging with Conservative MPs in a way that can sort of get your foot in the door. Now, that's something that we certainly are very well aware of. Is how do we go about that? What are the issues that are going to open the space for a discussion around climate, renewables, transition, and a clean energy future, really? And so one of the things that we did in April, I think we achieved this, we worked very, very hard behind the scenes with all of our influencers across the agricultural sector to push for a national strategy on climate change and agriculture to be agreed and endorsed by the Ag Ministerial Council, which is the meeting place for the Federal Agricultural Minister and all the state-based agricultural ministers. Now, the reason that we were able to be successful in actually getting that up is that politics is a little bit different in the country, and in many ways it's a case of who knows who and who holds the influence where. And that's where Farmers for Climate Action is incredibly lucky, in that we have a strong team of volunteer farmers from around the country who are very well connected and very well engaged politically and have been for a long, long time. So by working with those key influencers, I'm delighted to say that we actually were successful in getting that strategy up and advanced. And so we should be having a national strategy rolled out, or at the very least, put into place from about March next year, which is a very exciting step forward. And it's through tapping on the shoulders of those influencers and knowing exactly who to send in the door with the Conservative MPs to ensure that your message is listened to, that FCA is able to gain some of the traction that we have been achieving. The other part of that, of course, is how do you have that conversation with a Conservative MP who ideologically, through the warfare and the debacle that has occurred over the past decade, it's become almost political poison for them to actually acknowledge the realities of climate change. So it's a case of saying, well, look, let's get those farmers who are already experiencing the impacts, and let's talk about their future. Let's talk about how they are able to adapt. Let's talk about how they are able to mitigate. And let's start with some of those safer topics rather than going with a combative political frame. How can we constructively work together to actually move forward into the future? And then, of course, renewables comes into the conversation. And as Adam Marshall's comments so eloquently put, the future for renewables is happening. And it's a case of keeping our foot well and truly on that pedal to make sure that the transition does happen and that rural and regional Australia is able to get significant benefits out of that. So we work with these MPs right across Australia. Some of our core electorates include Maranoa, which is the Federal Minister for Agriculture's region. And one of the exciting projects that is happening there is the local councils are actually taking the lead. So under the RAPID initiative, has anyone heard of the RAPID Council program? Anyone on the call familiar with it? No? Okay, lots of shaking of heads happening. So the Rapid Council Initiatives is a group of councils throughout that Western Queensland region, so Roma, Longreach, Barcoo, etc., who have come together to talk about, well, what does a diversified and strong future look like for us as an area? And it's been particularly well led by Ed Warren, who is the Longreach Shire President, or mayor, I'm not quite sure what the term is for them, who is working very hard on these issues, and Bruce Scott, who is a grazier from the Barcoo region, a very, very well respected man agripolitically and indeed within the political circles. And he is one of the ones that is truly driving this strong transition and strong push for it. I don't know how familiar many of you are with the Talking 2030 program, which has been rolled out by the National Farmers Federation over the last 3 months. But the objective of that is to actually work towards a $100 billion agricultural sector by 2030. And the exciting thing, and the reason that I raise it on this call, is that out in Western Queensland, at Longreach, the workshop that they did there, in the heart of the Federal Ag Minister's region, one of the key messages that came home from that electorate when they went out there and had those discussions was, how do we embrace renewable energy, and how do we move even more quickly to a clean energy future to diversify, to deal with the impacts of climate change. And I think, after 6 years of straight drought, your eyes are well and truly open to the alternatives that you need to explore, whether that be exclusion fencing or renewable energy. And that's where a lot of these farmers are currently at. So moving beyond Maranoa, of course, New South Wales, or most of New South Wales at the moment, is enduring a very challenging seasonal conditions with dry conditions even affecting those traditionally very strong areas like the Liverpool Plains and Hunter. So what that is also doing is it is creating a climate where more and more of these farmers are saying, look, we cannot necessarily prepare for this to the same extent that we need to. So how do we diversify? And some of our farmers are saying to us, look, I'm able to get through this drought and I feel relatively okay getting through it. And the reason for that is because I already have diversified my income streams and I'm supporting wind turbines. So my neighbours and I, we are actually in an okay position, not great. We've had to destock and deal with all the rest of the drought conditions, but I'm going to be okay because I've embraced those benefits of renewables. So this is the sort of conversation that we are starting to see happening right across Australia. And I think it's time to really, shake off those shackles of believing that rural Australia is reticent or behind when it comes to dealing with climate change. Our farmers, our graziers, our industry leaders, they're living out the realities on the front line of a changing climate. Agriculture is set to be one of Australia's most hard-hit industries by the impacts of climate change. So our farmers are starting to get on the front foot. They're starting to look at what they can do and how they can push more strongly, both politically and socially, to ensure that we do get the action starting to happen that we need. There are, of course, setbacks, and I think back to Michael McCormack, his comments that he's made just this week up at the Queensland LNP conference, which are very, very disappointing and quite interesting to hear from someone who, down in the Riverina, his farmers are really struggling with drought right now, and yet he is there pushing for coal. And so, of course, that's something that our farmers down in that neck of the woods will be following up and pushing on very strongly over the next couple of months, because we need to see that shift really starting to happen in a very organised and coordinated fashion. I mentioned at the start of my presentation, or start of my discussion, that we have recently expanded and we're bringing on 2 new staff members. And that's because the number of farmers that say to me, I felt I was the only one that was thinking or feeling like this. I really didn't realise that most other farmers, or many of the other farmers in my region, were also getting very, very worried about the impacts of climate change. There is so much demand from farmers out there, both for climate smart agriculture, for advocacy training, for media training, for political expertise. So much demand from farmers who want to get involved, want to get behind climate action, because they know that that is the key to their future moving forward. So, Christy, did you want to jump in and add anything there? Otherwise, I'm happy to take questions or to talk in more detail about the electorates we're working on, or, just happy to have a bit of a chat.
Thanks, Verity. Christy, if you do change your mind about jumping in, just jump in, okay? And thank you, Jim, as well. Jim, do you want to unmute as well? And we can possibly, what we can do is have questions to both of you in a sort of fairly free-form way. I would have a question to start with. I'm not really sure who it will go to. But some of you would know, I think, Verity, you probably know that the Western Australian Agriculture Minister is looking at convening a roundtable and about building in resilience. Low rainfall grain production in particular, I suppose, is going to be a target for Western Australia. And so I guess we're wondering, this is not really a Citizens Climate Lobby kind of question, this is more of a, a general climate and agriculture resilience type question. How open do people feel that other state ministers might be to, collaborating on national agricultural resilience and perhaps being innovative about it?
It's a really vexed question. I'll jump in, Jim, unless you want to add anything. Look, there's some really positive things happening with our state ag ministers. Some of them are Victoria, New South Wales, very, very strong, very open to these issues. I think, of course, it's a case of striking a balance and being a little bit cautious in which strategies you use to increase resilience within the system and how much you pin your hopes on any one particular strategy. And there is one state at the moment that is very focused on one angle. However, it's a case of making sure that we are having this coherent discussion at a national level. And I'll just go back to our national strategy on climate change in agriculture. One of the key things for us was making sure that it wasn't, when it was presented around that admin table, we wanted to make sure that the other state ministers sitting at that table put the pressure on. So it landed to a sea of friendly faces. And so that's exactly what we did. We sent in people to each of those state ag ministers, people that they already knew and trusted, sent those into them and said, look, this is exactly the sort of thing that we need to see moving forward. So I certainly think there is a lot of openness. We are, of course, heading into elections. Victoria in particular, we have a minister down there who is very, very good on these issues indeed. In fact, Victoria was the state that put the motion around a national strategy forward, and that is the state where Ag Victoria is taking the lead on developing that. So we are heading into an election down there, and where that will go, I'm a little bit reluctant to put a prophecy forward, particularly on a recorded link up. However, it is something that we do need to be very mindful of. And I think it's a case of continuing to build the rapport with each of these state ag ministers. We need to make sure that these issues transcend political ideologies. And that's one thing that was incredibly successful in this case, where we had, New South Wales, where Niall Blair is state ag minister at the moment, very, very receptive to an idea and to a concept that is being put forward by a Labor MP down in Victoria. So we really are starting to see that the ag ministers, at least, definitely doesn't apply to all the other ministerial positions, but the ag ministers at least are being quite constructive on many of these issues. And to be frank, they can't actually afford not to. Their portfolio is already being incredibly hard hit. They deal with very pragmatic people, which most farmers are. They're pretty pragmatic because they have to be. And when you've got trusted, respected farmers who have been at the top of their game, walking in your door and saying, we need to get serious about this, it's very, very hard to ignore that. I think the other thing that I'll just touch on very briefly, which is a little bit aside from your question, Jodie, but it's something that we sort of bounce around a lot, and that is, well, how is politics different in the country to what it is in urban areas? And I think the big part of that, again, comes back to relationships. And I'll use a state MP over in Western Australia as a good example of exactly how politics is different in the country, in that individual is deeply embedded in their community and is known by everyone at their community. He's there at the schools, his wife works in the schools. There is no escaping your electorate. And I think that is one of those things that is quite different in urban areas is that we tend to be, when we live within an urban area, quite disconnected, disengaged right up until that moment where we have to go and put a tick in a ballot box, whether it be at state or federal level. Whereas in rural areas, your MP is generally someone that you know personally and you are able to access, and you know that you can get them out. You know, if I use David Littleproud as an example, we know that we can get him out onto some of our properties, that farmers, you know, Farmers for Climate Action members are going to say, hey, David, you know, we went to boarding school together. We've known you for 30 odd years. Come around, have a cuppa. Those relationships are already there. And I think in most cases in urban environments, it's slightly different. You don't have that deeply personal connection unless you go and really fight for it.
Yeah, thanks for that, Verity. That's awesome. Guys, questions open. Just remember to unmute yourself if you're going to ask a question. If you like, you can put your hand up so I can organise it so not everyone's jumping in at once, and I'll unmute. A question for Jim? Or Jim, do you want to ask Verity a question? Who have we got? I think there's a question from the Sydney guys. Okay, you're unmuted.
So this is a question from Rosie to Verity. Just wondering, you mentioned the 6 electorates that you're focusing on. Could you elaborate on which 6 electorates they are?
Sorry, I take myself off mute. So Maranoa is one of them. So, of course, Littleproud, Riverina will be working in. Durack will be working in over in the west. Gippsland out with Darren Chester in Victoria. The Mallee down in Victoria as well. And then, of course, there's a couple of others that I'd prefer not to mention on this particular call because the politics is quite different in that space. And so one of the things that we are focusing on with those 5 that I've just shared with you then is these are federal seats where the MP is already interested, engaged, but not yet able to push the envelope in the way that we need them to. So our focus in those 5 electorates, and the remaining one that I haven't mentioned, the focus is slightly different. The focus in those 5 electorates is really strengthening and supporting the arm of the minister, of the member that is there, to ensure that they know that their electorate has their back on these particular issues. So the benefits of transitioning to a clean energy future, the benefits of taking action on climate change are highlighted by the key influences within that space.
Thanks for that, Verity. Who else do we have as a question? Nell and David. So Nell first and then David.
Hi, this is a question for Verity too. I was just wondering if you had kind of resources for farmers, or like I'm just thinking about people that I know up here and also in Maranoa. Yeah, just like when I'm talking to farmers that I know or people on the land, is there, what's, do we just sort of mention Farmers for Climate Action, or is there stuff that we can offer, or, just mention?
Such a good question, Nell. Thank you. We, within the next fortnight, should have our toolkits ready to go, which are exactly that. So we'll have a behind the farm gate style toolkit, which is all about, well, what can you do on farm, climate literacy, all of that sort of thing. But then we'll have a beyond the farm gate toolkit designed particularly for farmers. And that will be looking at, well, how can you have conversations and get active in your electorate? How do you message to a rural audience, to your peers, about climate change? Here's some skills that you can use to go and talk to your fellow farmers, to host a barbecue, etc. today, so that you can actually be equipped with everything that you need to become a strong advocate. So we've been pulling those together over the last couple of months. So they should be finalised within about a fortnight, which will be great, because it's exactly what is needed, is for those farmers to be able to walk away from any workshop that we've done, or even just from a chat with someone from CCL or one of our staff members, and have all of those resources that they need, both to support climate smart agriculture, to have improved energy literacy, and also to be able to speak strongly on many of these topics.
And will they just be available from your website? Or?
Yeah, they will be. So they'll be available from our website, but we'll also have printed copies. So if you would like some to be able to distribute, then just let me know and we'll be very happy to get some to you. And the same goes to anyone else who does any work in rural areas. We will be doing our first print run as soon as that is all finalised. So happy to share and get the message out there. For us, it's about growing the impact and growing the message as quickly as possible. And one of the key ways that we can do that is by empowering those who we come into direct contact with to become key change agents for the cause. So we're hoping through these toolkits that they will have all the resources that they require. And then, of course, one of our staff or our volunteers will be available at the end of the phone line if they need anything further to be able to go out and to, take action, or they need a hand to find additional resources or whatever the case is. We'll be there to supply that. We're also working on updating. Well, once we get through the toolkits, the next step will be to update the resources section of our website, and that will be quite a useful page over the coming months as well, once we start to get all of that more organised and ready to go.
Great. That sounds
very exciting, Verity.
Oh, I know. It's been a long time coming. I'm very excited about it.
That is just so fantastic. I'm sure we'll be all devouring that, and we can take it into our lobbying in September in Canberra as well. I know that there's a couple more questions. So there's a question from Duncan in Sydney, and also David. Did you have a question as well? David, I might unmute you first.
No, I don't have a question. Sorry, I was waving my hand around a bit.
No worries, that happens. And Duncan?
Yeah, I was just curious whether there's a danger of opposition using it as a point of difference when somebody is being turned out to be strong on the issue.
Did you hear that okay, Verity? Might have to...
Not really.
We might just ask you to ask that one again. It's a little bit faint.
Sorry about that. I was just asking if there was a danger that the opposition in any electorate uses it as a point of difference and with the elected government if it's switching in our direction.
It's a really interesting question. I don't believe so. So, for example, you're wondering whether the opposition being federally at the moment, Labor, someone would put the pressure on. Is that what you're suggesting because they're not taking action? I'm just trying to get clear about the question.
Sorry, it was that the opposition, particularly in the States, I was thinking of.
Oh, okay, yep.
But I guess anything's possible, but it was primarily the States I was thinking about. Yeah.
Okay. It is a really interesting question. So I might use a WA example again. And I don't believe it is so much a danger or a political risk. If we just focus on the national strategy, on state ag ministers supporting a national strategy on climate change and agriculture, tell me if this doesn't answer your question. I don't believe it is too much of a risk. I think for some states there is going to be a lot more pragmatism that comes into it, where they go, okay, well, this is, providing this doesn't drive up prices, which everyone always comes back to, this is something that, yes, let's have those quiet conversations, and we don't have to be oppositional purely for the fact that we are in opposition. So I think in some states it's not going to be a problem. In others, and I go to Victoria here, it does concern me a little bit, particularly given where the state opposition is currently at on a lot of their policies. Whether or not they use this to drive a wedge is quite concerning. But I think, again, that's where having those relationships and those farmer influencers who, let's face it, typically these Conservative MPs are from rural electorates, which is why we are talking about them. So there's some of their key influences, not all cases, but most, are going to be farmers. It's a case of making sure that those who are going to influence the opposition are also brought on board and engaged with at the early stages so that they can continue to drive the message home. And I think that's where working with both peak bodies at a federal, state level, those leading organisations who are able to then include this into their messaging around elections, their engagement with the opposition, whichever party that may be, is a constructive way to go about it. It's probably not risk-free, and I think Victoria, perhaps Queensland at the moment, is probably the states where it would worry me the most. But it's certainly something that I think engaging behind the scenes, having the key influencers, putting the pressure on, is probably the best way to prevent it from becoming a real sticking point. I think the neg is probably an example of where it, and I'll go back down to Victoria again. The neg is an example of where it could get problematic. And so one of the things that we are strongly advocating is that our farmers get very well versed in the targets set under the National Energy Guarantee, the potential implications for agriculture if those targets are not increased, to ensure that some of the politics and some of the ideology is taken out of it. And we're operating in a very much an evidence-based of, okay, well, this is where we've got to get to. This is where we're at. What does that actually mean for us? Therefore, how do we take some of the politics out of it and just move towards good policy? Does that help at all? It's probably a convoluted way of answering the question.
That sounds like a good amount of detail. The umbrella groups approach sounds good, and we probably all do have questions about the Farmers for Climate Action position on the neg. So maybe this is a good chance to speak about that a little bit.
Yeah, of course. So the neg as a mechanism is okay. I mean, I think we can argue till we're blue in the face that it's not a perfect mechanism, and frankly, it's probably down there about number 4 or 5 if we were to have our list of options. Unfortunately, those other ones are not on the table. So as a mechanism, it's okay. It's something, if we can get policy, that's a good position. What really, really worries us is those targets, because I think probably everyone around this table would agree that 26 to 28% reduction target is woefully inadequate. So of course we have very deep concerns about that. One is, all right, so if the energy sector is only going to be reducing by 26 to 28%, well, what does that do in terms of the emissions requirements for other sectors? Because agriculture right now is about number 3 in terms of sectors contribution. Over the next 10 years, we are expected to move up in our ranking based on the government's modelling and potentially be sector number 2. So that's a real worry for us. Now, we are supporting initiatives within the agricultural sector to get our own house in order, because absolutely we need to be on the front foot with our emissions reduction profiles within all industries. What we don't need to see, though, is buck passing happening, which is exactly what concerns me about the neg. Is, we are making, once again, like we did under Curdo, we are making agriculture politically expendable and allowing the energy sector to get away basically with a free kick. The other worries, of course, are things like the fact that really what does this do for investment into renewable energy generation? If we are having such low-ball targets set, then what does that mean for the investors who are looking to come into this space, who would be driving that clean energy transition? We know that the target's going to be pretty much met very, very quickly, with or without the neg. And we've got certain groups within this sector saying that, well, no neg is better than a neg with the current targets. So that's our primary concern in this space, is that those targets are woefully inadequate. It's a line that we have been pushing internally within the industry. Oh, when was this announced? Was it 16th of October, 18th of October last year? Whenever it was in October, FCA came out challenging the National Energy Guarantee and the way in which it was being rolled out. And I think, we haven't really improved too much from there. I know that at the moment, federal Labor is pretty much willing to agree to anything to end the climate and energy policy wars. And while I can understand that position, what really worries me is that if we agree to a policy that has inadequate targets set, do we have the political will and do we have the confidence that we are ultimately going to see a change in government, see an increase in targets? Are we going to see a change in government? I think we're leaving far too much to chance if we do not hold our politicians to account now, as they are discussing it, over where those targets are currently set. Now, I don't know how many of you caught up with the New South Wales farmers. They actually did a bit of media late last week, pushing very, very hard for these targets to be increased, and we were delighted to be able to support them in making those calls and pushing that, because that is a bit of a break from where the National Farmers Federation have positioned themselves. So it's fantastic to see within the sector we are, starting to really challenge and say, well, we need to do better. We need our policies to do better. And that's something that over the next couple of weeks, up until August, when it comes back around that table again, our farmers across the NEM will actually be reaching out to their respective ministers for both agriculture and for energy to say, look, we need to do better than this, and here's all the reasons why.
Thanks, Verity. It's something that we have certainly been spending a lot of time thinking about as well. And I think that when the framework came out, we certainly were offering sort of qualified support, but essentially we're requesting that the ESB goes back to the drawing board in some sense on targets and on how dispatchable ability is talked about in the framework as well. There's a bit of room for improvement there. And of course, on the affordability guarantee, it's so important, the affordability, they get it really right. And one of the proposals we've had is to consider something like a carbon fee and dividend as a way of guaranteeing affordability, because it's not just about the price of electricity, there are other ways to guarantee affordability. And so it's quite interesting to see the dialogue that's happening with the National Party on affordability. And I know there's many facets in there. It'd be interesting to get your take on that. But just want to ask Jim if you could just list the sort of top 6 electorates in terms of billions of dollars over the next 5 years, say, just approximately, that are going to the top 6 electorates. And then make sure that everybody who wanted to ask a question has done, because we'll be switching off soon and going into the national update.
I don't have dollar figures, and I don't have a time frame, and some of the announcements may be quite speculative, so I haven't really tried to nail that down, and I don't think I'd be capable of doing it. I'm not an insider. I don't have that level of information. David Clark, who's here, does know a lot about what's happening in North and South Australia. He's got a fantastic website, and that's one of a number of really great resources on this topic. The top 5 electorates, by my count of uncommenced megawatts in renewables, Durack in West Australia, most of northern Western Australia, and includes Kalgoorlie. And Melissa Price is the member, and she's Assistant Environment Minister. The second one's Maranoa, which we've heard about. That's David Littleproud, Nationals, Agriculture and Water Minister. The third is Grey, which is South Australia. Rowan Ramsey, Liberal, includes Port Augusta and Whyalla. So these are industrial towns in a regional setting rather than just a farming community. And that's important. There's also Broken Hill, which is another case of towns looking to renew, towns and their leaders looking to renewable energy as the way forward. And the fourth one is Kennedy, where Bob Catlett is a staunch defender of renewables, at times at least. And the fifth is Eden Monaro, which is simply because that's where the Snowy pump hydro project is meant to be. And if you don't include pumped hydro, the next one would be Parkes, which is Western New South Wales, which includes Broken Hill.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So I've got one more question. Walter's going to ask a question.
Look, hello, I'm Walter Gaynor, and I'm just a visitor in a way, but I've been very much involved for the last 3 years with you, but I'm also very much involved with Healthy Soils Australia, working with farmers all over Australia on resilience, regeneration, and what have you. But the question very much to Jim, a lot of people don't know it, but you see, of all the nation's water, 70% at the moment goes to agriculture, but 20% goes to actually the energy sector, very much for non-renewable, basically mining, but also then generation, right? So 20% of our water. And does this issue of the actual water demand by the current non-renewable energy users get taken up in the debate? Because what's happening now is actually, as things dry out, the demand for water from these non-renewable energy producers is going to become a very, very important erosion of agricultural water and urban water. For example, there's in Queensland now propositions to take billions of litres of water out of the Burdekin to, again, guarantee that for Adani and these other developments. And so really this whole issue of how we're managing our water, and is that water demand by the non-renewable sector one of the factors that you've got in the debate when you're going to see members of parliament? Because I would think that particularly the rural members have to be consciously aware of the risks that poses to agriculture.
Look, I think that's a fantastic point. From my perspective, I hear that that issue being raised in relation to campaigns on projects, but not in a broader sense. So maybe that's something we should pick up.
I think it's a really interesting one. Just to jump in on your question as well. Sorry, was it Walter? It's a really, really interesting one in that agriculture is constantly critiqued, and I think the Four Corners report on the impacts of irrigation on the Murray-Darling is a good example. The agricultural sector is constantly critiqued on our water use, and yet many of our farmers are among the most efficient, as you would know, most efficient users of water in the world. And yes, we have room for improvement, but we are very, very good in many instances. And so I think it's certainly a very valid question to be raising, and certainly one to continue to push. And one of the frames that we tend to use a lot is risk and resilience. And of course, the risk factor of competing, the competition for finite resources, becoming increasingly finite resources in many of these areas, is a major problem moving forward. I think it is also pertinent to note, though, that particularly during a time of drought, that renewable energy projects in their construction phase use fairly significant volumes of water as well. And that is, of course, only limited to the construction phase. But when we have a drought on and construction carrying on across New South Wales in particular at the moment, it is, I guess, an additional consideration to bear in mind when having these discussions. But it's a really, really interesting conversation to have about, well, how do we protect the use of water for food and fibre and, in fact, ecological resources as well against competing industries, whether that be coal generation or mining or whatever the case may be.
Great, thank you. I'm just wondering, Verity and Christy, is your Facebook page a good place to continue some of the conversations that have started today? Or somewhere else?
We'd love everyone to engage with our Facebook page and also with our Twitter as well. Christy does a wonderful job managing our Facebook for us, and we have a wonderful another volunteer who also does our Twitter, and very happy to engage and to answer questions in that space. Our target audience with our social media is primarily trying to get the rural community on board. And I know one of the, the challenges, and Christy, tell me if I'm stepping on your toes here, but one of the challenges that we find is this continual barrage of, oh, well, if you don't like it, vote Greens. Now, as a strictly non-partisan organisation, there's almost nothing more frustrating than being continually told that. So we'd love to be able to carry on some really constructive discussion about some of these issues and continue to engage, because I think the CCL community is just such a great avenue to achieve an impact. But that is certainly something that we are very mindful of in how we manage our social media, is making sure that we don't bring partisanship into it.
Absolutely. I mean, that's definitely what we pride ourselves on it too. So yeah, political but non-partisan.
Absolutely.
Very political. Like, it allows us to be more political anyway. So I'm going to just say thank you very, very much for all of that. That has been very insightful, and we'll be able to really use that, all of us, in our lobbying. So thank you, Verity, and thanks, Jim, for that research as well. And Jim has written up his research, actually. So if you do have an interest in that, sort of, it's like a survey, a non-expert survey of renewables in the pipeline, then just send a request to info@ccl.org.au, Now stay on the line if you would like to hear a really brief 10-minute national update. Essentially, it's what's coming up for us. If you need to go, Verity, to check your dog.
Deal with that snake.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking the barking was a good sign, but if it stopped, that's
Jody, if I may, just before, the electorates that I've mentioned, you know, if anyone is meeting, whether it comes through you, Jody, or whether there's another angle, please get in contact with us if CCL has engagements in those electorates, because it would be absolutely invaluable. We engage with other organisations as well, who are in a slightly different space in that they are strictly non-political too, but they also are active in these electorates. So more than happy to share information and to collectively build our capacity to make an impact in those regions. So please continue to reach out and engage, and I just encourage anyone who's on the call to do exactly the same.
Yeah, okay then, we'll do that. Thank you for the invitation. That sounds exciting as well. So all the best. If you have to go lead the call now, then thank you very much for joining. Come again next time, which is will be first week, second Saturday in August. And so, national update, save the date for the national conference. We've now set a date, 15th and 16th of September in Canberra here. 2 days of conference and training, workshops, and then followed by 2 days of lobby days. And Nell's come back. Well done, Nell. Internet dropped out. So 15th and 16th of September, it is actually the start of Flurry out in Canberra. And so if you're thinking of coming down, then now is quite a good time to investigate booking for accommodation, because it's a busy time in Canberra. It's also the middle of a sitting fortnight. That's why what we do. So 15th, 16th September, that's a Saturday and a Sunday, and then 17th and 18th, the Monday and the Tuesday, for 2 days of lobbying. Join us for both of those days, or just part, depending on your availability and your interest. What else is coming up? Next week, we've got the National Conversation on Thursday night from 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on this Zoom line. We often talk just about the news, but next week we actually have a presentation from our interns. We've got 2 interns starting with us at the moment. One based in Sydney, who helped us organise the New South Wales ACT Regional Conference, which we held here in Canberra about 3 weeks ago now, and introduced about 10 new citizen lobbyists to various members of parliament and senators in that time. So it's Jonathan, who's visiting from the US and is going to be going back and volunteering, maybe even working, he hopes, with Citizens Climate Lobby in Washington, DC. He's been so inspired. And we've got a journalism student, Angela Fain, who will be joining that call on Thursday night as well to talk about her interest in Citizens Climate Lobby. She's with us till October, 2 days a week, to help us prepare for lobbying and then do the follow-up. So join us for National Conversation to hear them. We'll also be having a bit of a conversation with Philip Sutton, who's the author of the No More Bad Investments legislation. He's a very experienced drafter of legislation. And as carbon fee and dividend Australia legislation hasn't been written yet, then this is our first steps towards to writing it. As you may have heard in the news, Canada is about to install a federal backstop carbon fee dividend style legislation. Being a Commonwealth country like Australia, it's something that we'll be looking at using and exploring ways that the policy can interact with other policies. So Phil will talk about the No More Bad Investments legislation, and also give us some pointers about how we might go about writing the CFD legislation for Australia. What else is there? The National Intern Program has really become an ongoing program now. And if you are in a state or territory that would like to send an intern to Canberra, then it's possible to build support for that through the Give Now crowd-raiser platform. So it costs roughly on average to send an intern to Canberra for 4 or 5 days, about $500. And so we're fundraising for that so that we can have, we're hoping 5 or 6 interns from all over Australia come and join us in September in Canberra. So go to the Give Now page and check that out, see if that's something that you would like to do, and to find out what the blurb is for the intern program. There's a one more thing. This is the last thing, and that is that there is there's an existing letters to the editor sort of coaching program that Jane, who's on the call, runs. Hi, Jane. And I heard a little bird told me that that program is expanding or about to expand. And those details are still being worked out. I haven't received them yet, but if letters to the editor writing is your thing, then Jane and I think Paula are expanding that program. There's a letters to the editor archive that's been set up, and it looks like it's going to get turbocharged sometime in the next month. Jane,
Jim, credit for this one.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Thank you, both of you. Yeah. So that's all really for the national update. Now, if you have any questions, now's a good time to ask them. No more questions? No questions about the national update, about the conference details? Okay. All right. Well, you know where I am, and info@ccl.org.au if you have any questions or comments. And thank you, Verity. I know you're ducking off. Thank you very much again for joining us. You too, Christy. It's really good to see you. Thank you, Jim. And Jim, it's time really for us to go. Thank you, everyone, for joining in on a Saturday. Feel free to stay on and chat if you'd like to. Queensland is starting their meeting soon, I think probably right now in a minute or so. So if you're in Queensland, want to find out what Citizens Climate Lobby is doing in Queensland, then just stay on the call.
Yeah, it'd be lovely to talk to you, Nina and Greg, if Greg's still there.
See you, Jane.
I just need to go and get my my charger because my phone's just about to die.
No problem. Hi, Joyce. Jim, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thanks for the opportunity.
That's good. Very good. Oh my goodness, I know how hard it is to get that information. It's kind of, it's not easy and yet so valuable. Nina, yes. Hi.
Well, since I'm new, I would like to know more about your CCL Australia intern program. What is that?
Oh, cool. All right then. Yes. And you're in Brisbane. Perfect. Well, we cover the costs of shared travel and shared accommodation down to Canberra for the national conference and lobby days for people who'd like to intern either as part fulfillment of academic program or completely separate from that. It does not have to be part of academic program. And we offer it through ourselves. We mentor and train and provide free access to the conference and all meals provided. So it's quite nice. It gives you a lot of experience in interacting with parliamentarians. That's essentially what we do for the conference, but also in training for grassroots climate advocacy. We provide all of that. So if you're interested, then send an application, which is just your CV and your interest, to me at info@ccl.org.au. If you want to find out more, go to the ccl.org.au website, and there's a whole page on the intern job description, essentially, which will give you quite a lot of detail so you can decide if it's for you. And join us on Thursday night at the National Conversation. We'll be having our two current interns. One of them will give a presentation and the other will introduce herself. You'd be very welcome to join into that, and that's a really good way of finding out if it's for you. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
You want to tell me a bit more about why you're interested?
Well, since this is my first day here, I'm actually doing a PhD on renewable energy and its impact on Queensland. But instead of from agriculture sector, I'm looking at from the hotel and tourist accommodation sector. They are very energy intensive sector, not as much as agriculture, but so in my research, I was arguing that if we can get these people on board and look at what's the impact in the overall, where we're talking about the statewide, so not just only the how much the money hotel can save, but also what's going to be a long-term impact on other people's energy bill, how many jobs actually going to get created, and what's your impact on the GDP on Queensland overall? And I saw this meeting on the Meetup application, and I decided to come and join. And I found that it's a really great way to get out of academia and see what people are actually doing in the useful, applicable way, of course.
And that's so
fantastic.
That's an interesting area, Nina. I must, because I know that we'd have members in, I think, what's her name? The state tourism minister's electorate, and I know that, yeah, we were kind of wanting an angle to talk with her about, and so that would be really fascinating to hear more about your research, because it is such a, yeah, I mean, I guess kind of similar to agriculture. It's kind of an area which, you know, it sort of does its fair share of polluting, but has a lot to lose.
That's right.
Yeah, so that'd be fascinating to hear about that. So where are you, sort of, how far are you along in your studies?
So I'm kind of in my second year now, but well, I teach as well, so it's kind of slowed me down a little bit. But so hopefully I'll graduate in a year's time. But the end product of my research is, well, hopefully it will be a website. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with simulation at all.
Assimilation?
Simulation?
Do you guys play a game? Do you know Sim at all? Do you play Sim?
Yeah. We're not all as old as we look.
Okay, so Sim-based is actually a simulation game. So I know that lots of people hear SimCity, where, okay, if I build my house here, what's going to happen in 50 years' time in this city?
Right.
So in this research project, I also use the simulation. So that means that I'm trying to create this kind of simulation that, okay, if Queensland decide to adopt maybe this much of solar panels, in 50 years' time, what will happen to your electricity bills? Hopefully, if I graduate out of it, I will hopefully have a website for people to actually go and having a look at, okay, if I do this and this, what will happen to GDP, jobs, and hopefully.
That's fantastic. That's really good. All right, great. All right, I'm sure everyone's thinking about how we can use that.
Thank you.
Hey, John, you're muted at the moment, so I'll just unmute you. There you go.
The recording.
I just thought I'd add a comment.